What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review episode 6 of season 5 of Better Call Saul, an episode called Wexler versus Goodman. Now, I've been locked in my apartment all day here in New York. I've barely interacted with any other human beings, so my social skills might seem a little off just because I've been in total isolation. And I'll admit that earlier today I was beginning to succumb a bit to the doom and gloom, but the best possible thing for putting a smile on my face was a really good episode of Better Call Saul. And for like the first 30 or 40 minutes, I was actually under the mistaken impression that it was going to be a soft, inconsequential episode. I was thinking, it's just kind of, it's okay, but, whatever. And then toward the end of the episode, it just soared and became so wildly unpredictable and so wildly entertaining, and I was just smiling from ear to ear. So this was the best way for me to bring a gloomy Monday to a close. Now, as always, I'd like to give a shout out to the latest episode of Better Call Saul Insider, and last week they had Peter Gould and Giancarlo Esposito on the show, and it was so cool having Gus himself on the podcast. He's so smooth and he's so charming, and he's made so many incredible shows and movies over the years. But I loved hearing his insights into his process as an actor, and he also had some funny stories to share about Jonathan Banks, who he considers to be a master actor, but they have a very different process, and sometimes they dance, and sometimes they fight. And Peter Gould also brought up how episode 5 took a lot of inspiration from the old classic TV show, The Prisoner, something I've been hearing about for decades, and I've never actually made the time to watch it. I know that for a lot of sci-fi fans out there, it's as important to them as something like Star Trek, so I might have to do a flashback review of The Prisoner at some point on this channel. Because like everyone, I'm spending a hell of a lot more time indoors, and I need shows to watch. Also, speaking of shows to watch, this upcoming Friday is season 3 of Ozark, and I've been hearing some really good things from some people who've had an advanced look at that season. So if you like Better Call Saul, Breaking Bad, if you enjoy these kinds of crime shows, and admittedly, Ozark is much darker in tone than Better Call Saul, but that's what I'll be doing with my Friday, and I'll get a review up as fast as humanly possible. In any case, let's dive into episode 6 of season 5. So the episode began with a really interesting scene that gave us some insight into Kim Wexler's mind, where we see her in high school being picked up from school by her drunken mother, who claims she only had one beer, but Kim's tired of the lies, she's having none of it, and decides to walk home while her mother drives off. And seeing that frustration over her mother's lies gives us an additional perspective on her behavior towards Jimmy at the end of this episode, but more on that in a bit. And because emotionally, the story of Jimmy and Kim dominated so much of this episode, I'm actually going to talk about their story second. Let's talk about Mike and Gus and Nacho first. Now, I love and adore all three of these characters. I think they're all total badasses in their own right. But this plot line is actually part of what was fueling my initial mistaken impression that this might turn out to be a soft episode. Because if you had told me an episode or two back that we're going to get an episode where Nacho, Mike, and Gus team up to take down Lalo, I'd be like, hell yeah, sign me up. That sounds epic. And I would argue that the storyline was interesting, but it didn't blow my mind. But in essence, what's going on is that Lalo is taking down all the low-level drug dealers working for Gus because he wants to chip away at his money to make Gus seem less useful, less profitable to all their employers down in Mexico. And so Gus retaliates by having Mike and Nacho orchestrate a very clever takedown of Lalo. And we essentially see Mike creating a trail of evidence leading to this gray customized 1970 Monte Carlo that Lalo likes to drive around. And also, quick side note, when Mike goes to the library, he picks up a few books for $0.25 a pop, one of which was Treasure Island. Now, for years and years and years, actually decades even, Treasure Island was one of those books that I always heard about, but always sounded very old-fashioned and just sounded far too wholesome for my taste. I finally read it about 2 years ago, and I was absolutely enthralled by it. It is mean and it is nasty and it's full of high adventure. But if you're ever looking for some old school fiction, Treasure Island will absolutely blow your mind. But getting back to Mike, it was fun to see him in kind of unofficial cop mode because Jonathan Banks is one of those actors who was just born to be a badass cop, whether they're talking about TV, film, whatever. And so all this evidence is designed to connect Lalo for the crime at the travel wire company. And between Nacho keeping tabs on Lalo and Mike knowing how to manipulate the local police, they finally call in a whole hell of a lot of cops to arrest Lalo. He's about to pull a gun, but he's totally overwhelmed by superior numbers. And we get this really cool dramatic shot with the camera looking up from the road as his hand dangles outside of his window and drops the keys. So that brought that story neatly to a close. Or at least until next episode, where it appears as if Lalo might actually have Saul Goodman as his lawyer, but I couldn't quite tell from the teaser whether or not that was the case. And real quick, before I dive into the story of Jimmy and Kim, I've been bemoaning the fact this entire season that we've seen very little of Howard, and we actually got some of Howard this episode, but it wasn't necessarily in a way that made him essential to the plot, but it was incredibly funny. And at the end of the day, Better Call Saul, while it's a crime show and it's a legal drama, all these things, it has always been, and I'm sure always will be, a very funny show. And we see Jimmy as he's leaving the courthouse one day after having successfully defended these two prostitutes, and he basically buys an hour of their time and sends them to a restaurant to embarrass Howard, claiming that he owes them money and so on and so forth, but it's really humiliating for him. But the best part of this episode by far was how wildly unpredictable the episode became as we see this drama unfold between Jimmy and Kim, where we weren't quite sure to what degree Kim was in on the con, if at all, because they've gotten so good at running cons together. Sometimes it's hard to tell when they're play acting, and Ray Seahorn is just a phenomenal actress, and she has this brilliant poker face, and as she became filled with righteous indignation at some of Jimmy's antics, I was just on the edge of my seat trying to figure out whether or not he was really pissing her off, or if this was some master stratagem on their part, because as we see at the beginning of the episode, Kim is ready to settle everything. She wants Mr. Acker to get $75,000, and if she can't get Mesa Verde to pay up, then she will make up for the difference out of her own pocket. And Jimmy's a little disappointed because he has been moving mountains trying to create this fake infomercial that'll tear down the good name of Mesa Verde. And seeing Bob Odenkirk playing Saul Goodman as a tyrannical, demanding, needy director on the set of this commercial was absolutely hysterical, because obviously Bob Odenkirk's an incredibly experienced actor and comedian at this point, and I'm sure he's dealt with all sorts of difficult directors. But we get this incredible montage with Jimmy as a director offering all sorts of confusing and really intense mixed directions to all of his actors. But when Kim decides to wrap things up and settle, I was terrified we would never actually see the fruits of Jimmy's labors with this little short film. And we see that Kim is trying to undo a lot of the damage from the previous episode. She and Rich settle the differences. They agree not to fight in front of the troops anymore, and they make a big display of going to lunch together. But meanwhile, we see Jimmy still plotting and scheming, and he reaches out to Olivia Bitsui, I believe that's what her name was, who was the original photographer who took the picture that has been used as the Mesa Verde logo for like 50 years at this point. And then the episode just exploded in the best possible way in this incredible negotiation scene where you've got Rich and Kim and Kevin and Paige all on one side, and then you got Saul Goodman on the other. And Kevin is there under the assumption that they're there to settle and that the $45,000 has been accepted by Mr. Acker. But instead, Jimmy just blindsides everybody, asks for $4 million. And that's when Kim starts saying, "Kevin, don't talk." And I was just riveted watching all this unfold, wondering, is she in on it or is she legitimately blindsided? It was so incredibly suspenseful. And then, of course, Jimmy pops in the DVD of his little short film with all these fake testimonials by people who've been wronged by Mesa Verde, whether they're getting rashes or black mold or wrongful evictions. And, of course, Kevin just goes into hysterics. His anger was absolutely hysterical. And then, of course, Jimmy whips out the big gun where he says Mesa Verde is guilty of copyright infringement. They misappropriated the intellectual property of Miss Bitsui, and that all the horse logos from Mesa Verde anywhere in the country, they're all going to have to come down. And what I love about the show is how, no matter how good the scripts are, no matter how great the dialogue is, the show always places special emphasis on visual storytelling. And we get this great zoom where Kevin is sitting there surrounded by all of his lawyers, just irate, just stewing in anger, and all of his lawyers are talking a mile a minute. They're all doing everything in their power to justify their hourly rates. But Kevin, who's a man of action, stands up, calls Jimmy personally, meets him in the garage, and makes a non-binding handshake agreement with Jimmy where they'll give $200,000 to Miss Bitsui, $45,000 to Mr. Acker, plus a few public apologies, and Jimmy promises to lift the injunction against the Mesa Verde logo. But this episode managed to keep me on the edge of my seat, wondering up until the very last minute when Kim finally comes home, was she in on it or was she not? And as we soon see, she absolutely was not. She is pissed, to put it mildly. She's not talking, and it's so pitiful watching Jimmy try to coax out of her the little game where she pretends to be Kevin. And as far as Jimmy's concerned, they just scored a touchdown. He's ready to do an end zone dance, but then Kim just lets him have it because she felt totally blindsided. She no longer trusts him. While she's always known that he's slippery, he's never played her or made her feel like a sucker before, and she frankly feels like she was stabbed in the back. And when she tries to convince Jimmy to say that it will never happen again, he can't even make eye contact with her, and he can't even say it. And we see that she's really at a crossroads. She's trying to make up her mind about what to do. And one alternative is that they just go their separate ways and they just cherish the time that they have together. And I'm not even convinced that the second alternative is what she was about to say, because she's so hesitant. And finally, she just says, or we can just get married. And then the show cuts to black. And you cannot ask for a more dramatic impactful, emotional cliffhanger than that. So once again, I thought this episode was soft initially, and then they just absolutely nailed it in the latter half of the episode. So I should never allow my faith in the show ever to be shaken ever again. So in the teaser for the next episode, we see a scene where Jimmy and Kim come to see Kevin, and I'm not sure if they're coming clean with him or not. Frankly, I'm much more interested in Lalo's upcoming trial and to what degree Jimmy's going to play a role in that. Because if you've been following my videos about the season, early on I was talking about how Lalo's basically becoming my favorite character of the show, but he's been missing the last few episodes, and I feel like there's a big giant hole in season 5 that needs to be filled by the presence of Lalo moving forward. So fingers crossed we get some amazing courtroom drama in episode 7 next week, and it's horrifying even to acknowledge that we're already going to be at episode 7 next week, but this season is zipping right along. It's going to be over before we know it, but I think I've showered the show with enough praise for one video, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, liking the video, but I hope everyone out there stays safe, stays healthy, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.